Hey, how are you?
Hello. I'm good. Good. How you doing?
Good, hanging in there. It is Wednesday and tomorrow's Thanksgiving. So it feels kind of crazy. I don't know if it feels like the first half of the year goes slow and then the last quarter of the year just like flies by and you're like, how is this happening? Like Christmas will be here before you know it and oh, so much stress.
That's how it feels. Like I was telling a client, I'm like, "Oh yeah, don't forget we're not meeting in a couple weeks because of Thanksgiving." And she was like, "Thanksgiving's next week." And I was like, "This was last week." I was like, "How?" So I feel
Yeah,
like
you're like,
it
sorry, we're
goes
not meeting
slow.
next week.
Yeah. It's like it goes slow and then it's like brrr.
I know. It is so fast. Okay, so let's hop in. You want to start, Chris?
Sure. Let me bring up. First of all, welcome everyone. So, today it's Liz and I. We're excited to hang out with y'all. If you're not familiar, this is the International OCD Foundation's live programming. There's a group of us that really put our heart and soul into this. We have a lot of other live streams, but every Wednesday at 9 a.m. my time on the Pacific, on the East Coast, it's noon. Every Wednesday, we are here, Liz and myself, except the second Wednesday. That's for a research roundtable with Dr. Abramowitz and Kyle King. But Liz and I answer your questions live. We have pre-submitted questions. We bring on guests. Sometimes there's topics. Sometimes the guests just hang out with us and answer like general questions as well with you. So a lot of good stuff. We always want to remember, though, that this isn't to replace therapy. It's really to give you direction. It's to give you access. Liz made a good point in our meeting this week. It gives you access to people like John Hirschfield, John Grayson, Dr. Abramowitz, some of the greats in the game that are really trying to push the needle and find new treatments and new avenues and stuff. So gives you access to that. It gives you a community. So we're happy to have you here. If you are feeling like you're hearing these lives and you might have OCD and are looking for care, don't forget to go to the IOCDF's resource directory. That's at iocdf.org /find-help. And then also, if you're really in a low place and you need support, don't forget that you have the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. You can dial 988. You can go to 988lifeline.org, or you can call 911 or go to your nearest emergency room. And then lastly, this is a safe space. We want to support each other. Everybody's here because they're struggling with OCD. So we want to create a supportive community. And then don't forget that this is being recorded. So I like to remind you that. So if there's something you hear today that you really enjoy, don't forget you can rewatch this on IOCDF's Facebook under videos or on YouTube under lives. And you can definitely share these with other people. So how are you doing? I was going to ask you, like, I've gotten so much vibes from my group about how they feel about holidays. And I always have to remember that my clients, especially those struggling, holidays aren't the same. So what are some of the things that you're maybe hearing from clients, or just kind of like the vibes you're getting from people as Thanksgiving kind of leads up?
Yeah, obviously we talk a lot about it here because as a residential program, it's really hard for patients to spend the holidays in a residential program and not necessarily home with family. But the reminder I always have is that yes, our holidays might be tough, but can we look at what we want them to be? And can we set that as a goal and a way to fight our OCD? So instead of being like, I'm at this residential program in Houston for the holidays and I want to be by my family in Colorado by the snowy fireplace, like I want you instead to be like, oh, I'm doing this work now so that in the future I can enjoy that snow and I can be present and with my family making s'mores on Thanksgiving. I'm making up if that's what anyone does. But I think that holidays are tough. They're really tough if you're dealing with mental health. They're tough if you're dealing with anxiety, especially social anxiety. You have all these expectations of social events and activities you have to do, but then also there's the stress of like getting presents. And I don't know about y'all, but I feel overwhelmed when we have short work weeks. I'm sure you do too, Chris, because it's like we have to
Yes.
like cram as much as we can in because we don't want to like leave things unfinished or leave patients unseen. And so there's just a lot of moving parts. And I think as a kid, holidays were, certainly pre-OCD, they were fun. And it was like you had off school and it was just this exciting time. And as an adult, you're like, they're overwhelming and how am I going to fit it all in? And this is stressful and this doesn't feel like, relaxing and, whatnot. But yeah, I think that holidays are something that I look at with a lot of things, which is can we kind of embrace where we're at and can we find a way to see what we're learning, how we're growing, even if it's in the midst of a struggle during the season. What
Yeah,
about you?
it's not quite a holiday, but I was talking with a client who just started an IOP with me, and they got to celebrate I was gonna say their first birthday, definitely not their first birthday, they're not one, but they hadn't celebrated a birthday in about like 6 years, and they were able to celebrate a birthday. I have a client with BDD who's about to celebrate her birthday, and for the first time she doesn't feel like she has to do like hours of rituals. And it's the same with holidays. It's like, I mean, I remember when my holidays were bad, it took me hours to get there. I felt contaminated because everybody was in our house. I felt very depressed and was putting on a show. So there's all these things behind it. But like you said, this is an awesome opportunity to say, like, I want this back. I want this holiday back. I want by this time next year, if Thanksgiving is a holiday you enjoy, I want to be able to walk in and not struggle with skin picking, or not wanting to isolate because of depression, or not feeling like I have to clean for hours afterwards. So I know sometimes in the moment, if your holiday isn't great, social anxiety was a good point to bring up, Liz. Don't forget that that can be your motivation and your drive to really work through the treatment to get to a point that maybe next year or the next holiday, you can be in a different place. But I feel like depression's a big one too. I heard that a lot in my group this week, is just this idea that, everything, the music, society's shopping, having a great time, everybody's laughing, and you feel like you're like on the outside, just completely shut down and not in the same place where you're supposed to be. We talked a lot about this idea of what you're supposed to and not supposed to.
That's right. Yeah. It's just oftentimes this feeling of like, I'm behind, or it's not, I don't know. I think of holidays too as like there's all this anticipatory anxiety that sometimes I feel like after the holidays are really hard. Of like, sometimes there's this excitement and fun of like you're together and you're with family, and for some people that's fun and exciting, and then afterwards you kind of crash and then you miss it and it feels lonely, right? So again, I love the comment from Sam that like holidays are not the greatest time of year, but then again, we have a choice to move through them in an adaptive and healthy way. Like, I just think that's perfect. Is some people it's the pre stuff before the holidays that are triggering. For some people, it's the actual holiday. For some people, it's after. And so how can we choose to be flexible, to be adaptive? And what I love, Chris, that I want us to spend a second on today is I love how OCD and anxiety treatment is translatable to life, right? Like the treatment, everything we learn in treatment is about, can we be flexible? Can we be adaptive? Can we go with the flow? Can we not be so rigid? Can things not have to be perfect? Can we not have to be certain? And that actually translates to all of these seasons of life and all of these things that evoke different emotions and different difficulties and different triggers. And I really love that.
Yeah, no, I've talked a lot. There was a really good, there was a BDD conference I spoke at in London, but there was a really good presentation on perfectionism and how it impacts BDD. But I also liked the talk, just a general perfectionism with OCD. And one of the things that the speakers talked about is the difference between rules and guidelines. And I think that's what we really struggle with OCD in general, is just being flexible. So, people will have a certain plan, and if it doesn't go the way that the OCD wants it to go, they shut down. It's like, no, it was supposed to be like this, and they get really stuck. So definitely, I mean, the treatment, I always remember John Grayson saying like he felt most people with OCD treatment did better through the beginning stages of the pandemic because they were really good at just kind of letting go, practicing that acceptance, knowing that we don't know exactly what's coming, but being able to be flexible. And that's what I love about ERP is it's like once you're done, it's not like this tool you learned and then you're like, well, great, that worked for my OCD. Spent all these years doing it and then it's done. It's like, no, ERP helps you just prepare for life. This practice of letting go, being more flexible, practicing adaptation. I always tell people, like, if we had a superhero as humans, it's adapting. If we look at like what all our ancestors went through, like famine, plague, caveman times, and we're still here. We're living in deserts. We're living on Antarctica. Like, we can be flexible and adaptive, and we learn that in ERP, and then we can apply that in real life. So it's a skill that will get you through life all the time versus the rigidity that we experienced prior to treatment.
Totally. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And that's what I want us to talk a little bit about today is I want us to talk about, I think so many times we come on here and we're talking about ERP specifically, we're talking about core fears specifically, we're talking about treatment. I would like us to spend a second talking about across the board. If you, Chris, were to say like, what are the things you hope people get out of treatment? What are the things you hope they gain? Like much more generally, like broadly speaking versus specific, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the first thing that I want people to recognize is that your brain is hyperactive. It's constantly scanning consciously and subconsciously for danger. So the first thing I want people to learn in treatment is your brain is blowing real situations up. I think a lot of times clients get frustrated because they come in and they're like, everybody's telling me OCD is making stuff up. outside of magical thinking, most subtypes have a little p of truth, right? Like if I'm afraid that I might hit somebody with my car, that does happen. If I'm afraid that I'm going to lose something important, that might happen. But the difference is OCD takes that, I think of that old story, The Princess and the Pea. It's like it takes a very small thing and it blows it up. And then OCD convinces you that you can't handle stuff. And so that's one of the big things I constantly am working with clients on is like, let's relearn your strengths. You are a strong person. Trust yourself, see yourself how other people see you. I think that's one of the great things about treatment is it really gets people to get confidence back into themselves that they can handle situations. We were just talking about it. I think another key concept is flexibility, being able to adapt, being able to shift and let go. I think that's super important. But I think the core of ERP treatment that I hope everybody's getting is like in life with OCD, but even past OCD, there are going to be some challenging things. You might want to start a business and that's challenging. You might want to run a marathon and that's challenging. You might want to start a family and that's challenging. ERP says, look, something may be challenging, but if it's your values and you're driven, kind of build up on your strength and your support system and start to move towards that goal, even if it's tough. So that's what I think when clients are done, something that they kind of gain that maybe the average person doesn't is this sort of like superhuman ability to see things difficult and to push past it and move through it to gain something. What about for you? Like, what are you hoping that clients will gain?
Yeah, it's really about having, like you said, just this bigger perspective, picture, understanding, whatever you want to call it, of what it really means to not be afraid of discomfort. Like, I think that at the core, when we really think about OCD, anxiety, BDD, anything, right? It's really about our unwillingness to experience distress, right? I feel uncomfortable. I need to fix it. It has to go away. I can't move through it. I can't live with that, right? So we start responding to that discomfort in an effort to like get rid of it. And if we can teach you anything, it's can you embrace discomfort, right? Can you be comfortable being uncomfortable? And this applies to everything in life. Your boss sends you an email saying he wants to meet on Monday. Are you going to be so uncomfortable that you're triggered all weekend? Or are you going to be like, okay, great, I'll meet with him Monday. And on Monday, he asks if you'll take on a new project. And you're like, yeah, sure. Versus being like, that ruined my whole weekend over that, right? When your kid falls and scratches their knee, are you going to be able to encourage them that like, we know it hurts, but you're okay and you're strong? Or is it going to be like, oh my gosh, I need to take you to the hospital. This is disastrous. And then they panic even more, right? So again, it's like, it's that life lesson of discomfort isn't dangerous. And can we learn how to move through discomfort, how to move through distress versus living our life where we have no tolerance for it, right? It's really about, when you think about it, interestingly enough, right? Like OCD is really distress tolerance is at the core of what we're teaching you. It just obviously it's through an ERP lens.
I think one of the things that the disorder does for a lot is people come in and it's all of they've created an adaptive lifestyle very heavy in avoidance. And what I've noticed is, and I'm sure you see it obviously at a residential, is like by the time people come to an IOP or especially a residential, their life has gotten smaller. And I'm not surprised because the only thing they feel they can control is their own bedroom. So suddenly work becomes too hard because they can't control the office. School is too hard. They can't control the campus. Even home is too hard because they can't control everybody else. So there's a lot of kind of like living in your room and a lot of avoidance. I don't want to go to school anymore. I want to be homeschooled. I don't want to work because I just can't be uncomfortable. I don't want to date because my partner isn't listening to my rituals. And so that's something that when people come into treatment, they've lived this lifestyle of avoidance. And what Liz was just saying is that, distress tolerance sounds scary, right? And I even hear therapists like, oh, OCD treatment doesn't have to be about distress tolerance. I always wonder, like, how are they able to prevent their client from ever being uncomfortable? Because life is uncomfortable. There's a lot of challenging things when you travel, when you get married, when you start a company, whatever it may be. And what the OCD treatment teaches you is to say, look, like we can't avoid anxiety. Nobody has an anxiety-free lifestyle. We can adapt to it. We can change our relationship to it. We can reduce stress, of course, but we can't be avoidant of it. And when we start to realize that we're stronger than the anxiety and to stop being scared of it, that's when we really thrive. So what Liz is talking about is a lot of times people avoid ERP because they hear that distress tolerance. We're not saying that you're doing fear factor like exposures. We're not saying we're deliberately trying to make life hell. What we're saying is when challenging times come up, you will learn the skills to be able to address them head on, to handle it, and to actually thrive through it.
Yeah, and I just want to add in there that one of the things that we know and we feel strongly about is that ERP treatment should not feel like this prolonged distress. So I want to be clear about that. That I think a lot of people also think ERP means distress forever, and that I just have to, like, I hear this all the time when I'll say, "Hey, what do you think the goals of treatment are?" And people will say things like, "Well, that I have to just be comfortable always feeling anxious and always having these thoughts, and that just have to accept them and live with them." And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's the furthest from the truth. Like, if we are, how awful if I'm trying to teach you that ERP treatment means you have to be uncomfortable like this forever. It's like, no, ERP should give you clarity. ERP should give you freedom. ERP should actually allow you to not really feel anxious and to for thoughts to be thoughts and for them to not become triggers. So if what you're finding is that as you're doing ERP, it's that you're just like struggling and like you're having to choose to live by your values while you're struggling, and that you think that's what your life is, that's white knuckling. That's actually, I'm doing ERP, but I'm holding on. And so I'm just like writing my way through it versus like I'm actually doing ERP and it's getting me clarity and it's getting me freedom. You do not have to accept a life because you have OCD that is a life where you have to have this mentality or thought process that, okay, I can live by my values and still really be struggling.
Yeah.
I really hate that. I want to be clear about that, Chris. Like, I see this everywhere where I see people saying things like, you know, you can really feel anxious, you can have bad thoughts, but still choose your values. And I think the problem with that statement is that a lot of people hear that as the way you're going to have to live your life is by like choosing to like just push through and do valuable things while feeling crappy. And that's what OCD treatment is. That is not what treatment is. Let's go back to 2 weeks ago when we talked about core fears. Treatment is addressing your core fears so that you can live by your values, and OCD doesn't have a role in your life anymore. If OCD still has a role in your life and it is still walking alongside you while you're having to live by your values, we have not done all the work. I know that's hard to hear, and a lot of people don't believe that. I was someone who didn't believe it for decades. But that is the truth about treatment. You should be able to get freedom. You should be released from these fears so that you can live by your values with nothing else holding you back.
Yeah, and additionally, to add to that, I mean, it reminds me of two concepts. Actually, it was at the Game Changers conference, I think, in 2019 and 2020. You know, I remember when Chris Bear, who's a great friend of the show, obviously, and he's a huge friend of ours. We love Chris Bear and Unstuck, but he really talked about this concept of like once you kind of move past like a lot of, you know, you're doing ERP treatment. One of the things that he saw in his daughter, and one of the concepts that his family kind of was yelling from the rooftops is like OCD lies every time. And I think in the beginning, you can't quite see that because it doesn't feel like this disorder. It feels like just general safety. But as you work through the treatment, you know, I think a lot of people get hung up on this concept of doubt versus uncertainty, you know, acceptance of uncertainty, acceptance of doubt. What we're saying is in the beginning, when you're dropping your compulsions, you will feel like your whole worldview is shifting. And you will feel like, wait, this is how I always was like sure that my locks were locked, or I was sure I didn't hit someone. But that was always a false sense of security. And we know that because in real security, we don't have to do things 8 times in a row to feel secure. So as you're letting go, you're going to feel some uncertainty and some doubt and some confusion. But as you start to move back to the way that you learned how to figure things out pre-OCD and how the rest of society learns, you start to see the way that OCD tricks you. I always talk about cognitive distortions with clients, and I'm like, this is the way that OCD speaks to you in a way that tricks you and gets you to buy it every time. So as you move on, you get this concept of OCD lying. I don't remember who it was. I don't know if it was Dr. Stephen Phillipson or someone else, but this idea of like, not only does our amygdala really deal with heightened fear, but it deals with like possibility and imagination. And so in 2020, when he was talking about this, he's like, the reason that we can hear a sound and assume someone's breaking into our house is like when we're in that heightened state of fear, our imagination goes wild to keep us safe. It's not just the house shifting a little bit, it's a bear climbing in so that you'll be ready to defeat it. So treatment also gets you clarity cognitively. And I think that's something that people forget, is that you will get to a point that you're not just in doubt forever. A lot of the things that I dealt with in the past through ERP I've resolved. I don't still buy into the same lies. And so one of the things I tell people, because people will ask me all the time, how long does it take to get better? And I wish I had a really concise, awesome answer, but there's so many factors like comorbidities, level of care, et cetera. But just like Liz was saying, if you feel like you're doing treatment and you've been doing it for a very prolonged time and you're just kind of suffering, but you're suffering less than you used to, ask your therapist, are we dealing with core fears? Are we tackling things head on? Are we dealing with the cognitive side of things? Are we pushing ourselves? The other thing people forget sometimes is part of treatment is getting back into life. If you're at home all day with nothing to do, your brain's is going to continue to kind of push back to OCD. But if you're working, if you're in school, if you're like volunteering, if you're traveling, suddenly those life goals become way more important than OCD.
Totally. Yep. Couldn't have said it better. Yeah. So it's, and again, I think that something I want to ask you that I'm asking people today is, what limitations are you accepting in your life because of your OCD, anxiety, or mental health diagnosis?
Yeah,
What
that's a good question.
limitations are you accepting in your life because of it, right? And I know a lot of us did this for a while. It was like, oh, well, because of my
Travel.
OCD, I can never do this, or I can't have this, or this is how my life will be different. And we start to accept it. But when you're accepting that your life has to be different because of your OCD, or that there's limitations on it because of your diagnosis, what are you also doing? Well, you're telling OCD that, yeah, you're going to be here forever. Yeah, you're going to be a part of my life. Yes, you're going to be a decision maker in how I live the rest of my life out. And we're sitting here saying, no, like that doesn't have to be the case. And so our mentality, our thought process, the limitations that we put, it all has to be blown up. It all has to shift. And I do think, Chris, there is a lot of value in cognitive work in OCD treatment, right? We can't just do ERP if someone has these cognitive distortions that haven't been addressed, right? Or if somebody has these core beliefs or this low self-worth, like we can't just ERP and ignore that. Like we have to do both. That's what clinicians do. We meet your clients where they are.
I don't know if you feel this way, and then I want to go back to your conversation about limitations because I think it's great. But one of the things I did is I've created these like 10 rules around contamination, and I share them with all clients. I have like slides on them and et cetera. And what I start to feel is like sometimes in the beginning, and one of the things I think sometimes newer clinicians sort of jump over is if somebody's been dealing with, like, I'm just going to use contamination as the example, but severe contamination, they've almost forgot how real life contamination works. They will think like that couch that somebody sat on 6 years ago is still contaminated. Now to everybody else, we know like things can't just sit and like live like active cultures, right, for 6 years on a couch. But somebody who's been reinforcing that for a decade needs to be retaught. Or a big one that comes up in the support groups I run is people who haven't been dating because of OCD for a long time. And they start getting OCD concerns around dating, or like their brain starts to make dating black or white. So I think a lot of times prior, the cognitive work that Liz is talking about is sometimes it's like to slow down for a second. And that's what we were doing with a guy in group last night, is we're saying like, look, you're so badly wanting to be in a relationship to like check it off as an exposure that you're not dating. You can't just like bully people into dating you for an exposure. And it's like, he was really receptive. So it was a great conversation, but sometimes we've forgotten how to do stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think with accepting limitations, like travel was a big one for me. There's just so many things about traveling that is triggering. And I was just like, why do it then? But once again, it was sort of like once I started speaking years ago about OCD and I had to travel for it, and then the conferences and stuff, it was like, man, all of this stuff that I gained from travel, I would have just pretended it didn't matter to me if I would have listened to OCD.
Absolutely. Okay, so many questions. We have to get into them because you and I can chat all day. So let's start with a pre-submitted question. How do you feel separate OCD shame and guilt from real shame and guilt? such a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I really believe like the start comes from, the start of it is I always define guilt and shame for clients because I sometimes think people use those terms incorrectly. Like they'll be like, oh, I feel bad. I didn't pick up my friend from from the airport. I feel guilty. And I'm like, guilt's when you've done something wrong and are sort of feeling bad about it. You might feel a different emotion, but the difference is like, what I always tell people is without OCD, people have an incident occur first and then they respond. So if they're feeling guilt or shame, they did something or they've consistently done something or they've been caught for something. That's the I, right? That's the incident. And then they're responding to it. That's how my friends and my family deal with it. With OCD, there may not be an incident. We may have had a thought or a feeling or something like in the past, if we have false memory OCD or real event OCD, we might get a thought, we might be triggered by a news story and then start to wonder, like, did I do something like that 10 years ago? Could I have done that? And so what happens is like, or I don't want to forget like sensations, right? People that have like growing sensations or sensations sexually, if they're around family members, kids or animals, right? So there isn't something that they've done. There isn't something that they've clearly done and are sure of it. And like 5 people would definitely say like, yep, you did it, right? And then they're feeling guilt and shame. They're feeling shame and guilt for aspects of the disorder. So it's really important for a client to understand the difference, because if somebody is feeling guilty because they may have done something bad 10 years ago when they're in college because they saw the news and they thought maybe I could do it, if they own that guilt and shame, those are intense feelings and it's really strong. It's really difficult for them to drop those compulsions because it's really strong emotions. So I think that's the key is like, did you do something? Is there an incident? Now, let's say it's not OCD, right? And someone really did and they feel some guilt and shame. We're all human. We have to apologize. We have to grow and learn. But the problem is my clients that come in with guilt and shame around situations, they didn't do anything. They thought something or they felt something or they questioned something, but they haven't done something. Or the other caveat is they've done something so minute and small that nobody else reacted, but they're blowing it up in their head. I can't believe that I forgot to buy my friend a gift. I'm a horrible friend. Nobody likes me. I'm a bad person. And it's like, but your friend said it's fine. So I think that's the only caveat is when someone's done something that hasn't met a threshold of guilt and shame, but they're guilting and shaming themselves simply because they've been kind of punishing themselves self-wise.
So the one thing I do want to add in, though, is that I do find that sometimes there is a lot of guilt and shame associated with OCD. And I want to explain this in a avoidance cycle. But like, I am triggered by my kids, so I avoid spending time with them. And then it evokes guilt that I feel guilty. I'm not able to be present as a mom. And so as it's really interesting because it's like the guilt isn't OCD. The guilt is real that I'm feeling, but I'm feeling it because of my OCD, like my OCD avoidance or my OCD compulsions I engaged in or whatever it might be, that guilt can be the secondary emotion. And so I think what's really important though is being able to see it as like, this is my OCD, not what I wanted to do or chose to do, but also using it to motivate yourself for how you can do things different, right? So I avoided my kids. I feel guilty about it. I'm going to make it a goal to not avoid my kids and to set that as my ERP, right? So how can we take, John Grayson talks a lot about how can you say like, what are the things OCD has taken away from me? And how can you turn that into a motivating goal for yourself, right? So that's how you set your goals and you set your direction and your intention on what you want to do based on what you don't want OCD to be taking away or how it might currently be limiting your life. The second piece I'll say is how can we, this is such a good conversation, so I'm going to go all over the place a little bit. Sorry, also just try to follow me. But if we're moving on from guilt, I want to just be really clear that there are a lot of situations in which there's real life thoughtfulness, anxiety triggers, and there's OCD, right? So let me give an example. I am talking to Chris and we have a conversation and Chris gets a little upset by something that I say. And that night or the next day, I'm ruminating a little bit on it and I'm kind of feeling guilty, but I'm really kind of thinking to myself, man, like I wish I would have said that different. I wish I could have explained that situation a little bit better, and like what might I do in the future, and how might I show, like, be able to have a corrective experience from that situation. Like, I don't like the fact that I offended Chris, and like that's real, that's honest, and I want to be thoughtful about it. That's not OCD guilt, right? That's actually just like, that's real life guilt of and the thing I'll say is that it's not OCD because I'm actually able to just be thoughtful, and I'm not responding to it with like urgency. I'm not panicking about it, but I'm able to just be thoughtful about it, of like, oh, I don't like the way that came across, right? And this has been a really important learning curve for me. I don't know, Chris, if you can relate at all, but I think for myself in the past, I always like wanted to define something as like, it's either OCD or it's not. So I wanted to put it in these categories of like, oh, that's OCD and I need to treat it as OCD, or I shouldn't have to worry about it at all. And sometimes it was actually harder for me to be like, hey, here's how it could become OCD, right? So the way that could become OCD is like, I call Chris right away and I'm like, Chris, did I offend you? I'm sorry if I said that. I hope you're not upset with me. And then I keep texting him to make sure he's not upset. And then I'm ruminating on it. I'm asking 3 people for reassurance about it. Right. At that point, that's shifted into OCD because now I'm like wanting certainty. I'm wanting it to be okay. And I'm treating it with urgency. In the past, though, after I feel like I first got treatment, it was like, oh, it's either OCD or it's like, oh, I don't want it to become OCD, so I shouldn't have to think about it at all. I did nothing wrong. And actually, it was a little bit harder it still is harder for me to live in that area where it's like, hey, like, can I actually allow space to be thoughtful about the fact that like, I didn't like the way that played out. And I don't have to take it to an OCD degree of like reassurance and ruminating and confessing, but I can take it to a thoughtful degree of like, how might I want to approach things differently, right? And how would I want to learn from that situation? And I don't know if you can relate at all, but I feel like there was this piece for me after treatment where it was like, I either should have no anxiety about anything or it's OCD. And it's like sometimes actually that thoughtful, more difficult place where we learn and grow as human beings is a place we don't really want to go with OCD because we have like this total desire to avoid anxiety at all costs. Can you relate at all, or is that just
Yes. When I was back in treatment, I thought everything was either OCD or not. And I thought it was very clear.
Yes.
And what happened was like, as I re-engaged in life, because unfortunately, like I was housebound, so I wasn't really engaged in life. My treatment was more about just my existence. But as I got into life, there was a lot of things that fell in the gray where they weren't OCD situations per se, but I had a lot of, active obsessing, active compulsing, active mental ruminations about it. And so what I started to learn, unfortunately, after my treatment was that things are not going to fit in those cushy categories anymore. There's going to be some things that are clearly OCD, like the fear that somebody's poisoning my water. But there's going to be certain things where I'm in a relationship and my partner is upset and they're not really getting back to me right away. And somebody who doesn't have OCD might say, well, your partner's a little upset. Why don't you give them some time and space? And my brain was making up all these stories about like, they're going to break up with me. They hate me. They're cheating on me. And so there was like a blend of stuff. And so I had to start getting good at recognizing when OCD was speaking to me versus when it wasn't. But yes, there was a lot of situations. I used to think it was so clear in treatment if something was OCD or not. And it was like afterwards, there was so much stuff. I think another good point that you made that I know Allegra Castens has made as well is like a lot of the times the guilt and shame can be on compulsions we've done in the past. So like what you were saying about not spending time with your kids if you're doing compulsions and then feel guilty about it. And that's a place of healing as well, is to recognize that we were not always in the clearest state of mind when we were avoiding family members, when we were doing compulsions, things like that, because we were in so much distress. So that's why I always love the self-compassion piece that Kim Quinlan speaks about, is we're going to have done a lot of things we weren't happy of or proud of, or we feel like we're behind or wasted time because of OCD. We definitely got to give ourselves some compassion and some okayness.
Absolutely. Some okayness. I like
that. Yeah, some okayness. It's okay.
But I do, right? I think it's this piece too of like, I do think that I used to try to like, even when things didn't go well and it was like, oh, that's not all OCD. I tried to label it as all OCD because then it was like, oh, well, I don't have to think about it, right? That felt easier than having to be like, no, like that actually, there is room for growth there. And the other thing I will tell y'all that I struggle with still sometimes is sometimes I feel like when I have, so this happened to me actually last week. I had a conversation with a friend that I was a little bit triggered by after, of like, oh, I don't like the way I said that. Like, that is not like, I could tell what I was trying to say did not come across the way I wanted. And I talked to my husband a little bit about it, and I was just telling him, and I was like, oh, I just feel bad. And his response is really interesting, because I'm always like, but it wasn't my intention. And he's like, yeah, like, I know it wasn't your intention. And you can still be thoughtful about the way you might say this and the way that may have come across. And I was like, that's fair. Like, that, I totally need to hear that and understand that. But it was interesting, because I think that there was a period for me where sometimes when I have these tough conversations, or these, I don't know, scenarios that don't go great, right? That's life. And I want to like be thoughtful and grow and talk about it and learn. Sometimes I feel like I can't talk about it, because I have this thought that like, oh, that would be reassurance. And I find that I also go to this degree of like, oh no, I just have to like live with this and sit with this anxiety, versus like, no, like sometimes it's okay to talk about it and to be thoughtful with someone you love, and not turn it into reassurance, but like get feedback and get thoughts, not confessing. So anyway, it's interesting, and only we will know for ourselves when it's turning into OCD anxiety, when it's not, what that looks like, what doesn't, that sort of thing.
And I think as clinicians, like one thing we want to help our clients do, because it's not universal, is start to identify ways that OCD is showing up, so you could catch it in the beginning. I know for me, like I start shutting down. Like I will be sitting at a restaurant and I'll sort of tune people out to where it's like, Chris, are you here? And that's a sign. If I can't tell you what's just happened in the last 10 minutes, I'm ruminating, right? So I think it's super important to help clients recognize, or if you're on here supporting yourself as a person with OCD, start to recognize, like, as you engage in kind of mental and physical compulsions, what's the lead up to that? Are there certain triggers? Are there certain situations? Do certain like emotions happen? Do certain feelings, sensations? Because if you can catch it in the beginning, it's so much easier to stop than after, doing compulsions for a while.
That's it. All right, let's go to the next questions. So the next question we're going to go to is a question from Spence. If you want to pull that up, that would be great. What at 11:17 my time, Brennan? What are your thoughts on? Wow, I don't know, terms of what you eat affects the way you smell. So butyric acid is found in dairy products. And do you find concern outside of the Asian culture is the same as olfactory reference syndrome? So this is when like we have this fear or thoughts that people can smell us. My husband actually has a little bit of this fear, but like asking, sometimes this can turn into like asking repeatedly, like, do you smell something? Or just having that anxiety that I might have a smell that people are smelling.
Yeah, so I did a deep dive. Spence asked this question with our live with Kim Quinlan, and I saved it. I was like, I'm going to do a deep dive on that. And the reason he asked, do we see it outside of Asian culture, is because it's an Asian term, and it's very common in the Asian culture. I would say outside of people with like OCD and phobias and anxieties, of this fear of like smelling. And like he put, is there certain stuff in dairy, and so people might avoid it. So I was wondering, like, do we have that in the States? And absolutely we do. They're the olfactory reference syndrome. So I see it in two different ways in clients. The most common way is a feeling that they have a body odor that people can smell. It reminds me a little of BDD in the sense of like people with BDD will see a flaw in their face and everybody around them is like, no, I don't see it, but they don't believe people. That's what I've experienced majority with clients dealing with this, is where they feel like they have a certain odor.
Great.
It could be the general body odor or a certain odor that they smell on themselves, and their family, their friends, therapists, doctors will not smell it and will say, look, we don't see it. And they'll get very frustrated that people are lying, or they're not being truthful. And a lot of times it, of course, ends up in a lot of social avoidance, not really going out. Sometimes there's an overuse of products and showering and stuff, but it's not universal. Sometimes people are like, it doesn't matter how much I shower, etc. The other time I sometimes see it, just not as common, is where somebody like will have like a minor, like more social anxiety. Like they'll have like minor smell after like walking in the sun, and they're very self-conscious of sweat and smell. And other people either can't smell them, or maybe it's slight. Sure, you were walking around Disney all day in the sun, but then they feel like it's this blown up big thing of like, it's so embarrassing. I got to bring deodorant with me and stuff. But going back to the original, we do see that. It's difficult because we're so used to with like OCD and stuff. Like, yes, it's our senses that pick up on things. Like I see that I hit somebody with a car. I felt a bump in my car. We don't talk about smell a lot. Sometimes people will have OCD with smells. Sometimes it's chemicals. That's how they know that there's chemicals being sprayed or things like that. So just like with treating other components of anxiety, of OCD, of phobias and stuff, is like what you're trying to teach the client is like they have this messaging that they smell and that they stink, and they've created this whole world around it and this belief system around it that's navigating their life. And just like everybody else with avoidances, like they're going to have to put themselves back in life. And just like somebody with OCD may genuinely feel like they hit somebody with the car, this person may genuinely think that they smell, but they got to put themselves in those situations regardless.
That's right. Yeah, it's about doing values-based activities and finding a way, figuring out a treatment method to where this fear isn't going to run your life. And for some people, that's making sure you're not avoiding, but it's also allowing space for the core fear. It's figuring out, looks different for each person, right? But it's all about how can I, again, I want to be clear. We don't say you need to accept your worst case fears as truth. So we don't need you to purposely make yourself smell and go somewhere and purposely be smelling. Like that's not the goal of treatment. The goal of treatment is that you can allow space for the discomfort around the fear if it comes up, so that again, the fear doesn't run your life, and then eventually the fear has no power and goes away. Next question. And when we get, how to determine which fears are rational and which are not. I'm taking medicine for OCD, but feeling scared about things like microplastics and PFOA chemicals feels kind of rational for me. How do I differentiate?
Yeah, going back to our conversation earlier about this concept of wanting to put things in these really comfy, piles of like OCD or not, this is going to be a situation. Like people who don't have OCD might have a more organic lifestyle or not use certain plastics or things like that. I've seen places that advertise. There's a health food store by my work, and it's like they have everything in glass. They have like water in glass. They have milk in glass, and they're like, oh, so there's not plastics and stuff. What happens though with OCD is it may be rational to want to avoid, your interactions with pesticides. So you eat more organic foods. The difference is when we have OCD, it becomes a fixation, it becomes an avoidance. And we got to remember the last letter in OCD, D. What does D stand for? Disorder. What does disorder mean? It's causing high distress. It's causing a lot of problems in your social, your work, your school, your life functioning, right? So somebody who decides like, hey, going back to the microplastics, like, oh, I'm going to be more cautious. Like I might not buy plastic. I might buy water in bottles, etc. If people do that who don't have OCD, because like I said, I see it at stores all the time. The difference is like they just go buy the glass and move on with their life. People with OCD, it's like a fixation. They start looking things up. They start Googling things. They go down like that Reddit rabbit hole that Patrick McGrath said on our live once. They start to avoid things. They start to go above and beyond. They might go to doctor's appointments. They want scans, etc. So that's how you can really tell. Is like, is it causing distortion in your life to the point that you're disordered lifestyle, to the point that you're really finding it hard to engage in the things that matter, like family, friends, and work functioning.
That's it. Next question I want us I'm going to just I'm following the thread. And a couple of the things that have been said is like, how can you fight OCD? What does it look like? And I absolutely love Amy's comment at 11:33. She said, if it tries to influence me again, it gets treated like spam. And Amy went on to say that she believes you can be free from OCD as well. And then she said, it was about learning from the top experts, immersing myself in education and applying it, and support from the community plus continued involvement. I want to talk about that for a second, Chris, just because for a lot of us, our treatment recovery is not one and done with treatment, right? Like we can get this clinical treatment and it sets this incredible foundation, and it really allows us to have access to the effective treatment tools, all of that. But for many of us, the recovery continues after in different ways. Talk a little bit about what that was like for you.
Yeah, I sort of got you at my support group last night. There was somebody that got better, and she wasn't seeing anybody at my treatment, but she was coming to her support group and then stopped for a while because she was doing better. But she came back because she's like, oh, and I was telling people, they were asking me like, how come they don't think that I constantly relapse? And I'm like, because I am so immersed in this group. I'm so immersed in this community. I'm so immersed in these live streams. I'm immersed in the conferences. Like I do ERP every single day, multiple times of the day. I have a client right now who has some of the same fears I had. And we were doing exposures yesterday, and I was like, man, 10 years ago, this is what I was doing with my therapist, right? So the point is like embracing, like I think Amy is such an amazing representation of immersion into this community. Like it is a part of you, right? Like you get better from OCD, but the OCD wants to bring up urges, new doubts, new fears, right? So when you're at conferences, you're coming to these live streams, you're going to support groups, you're reading up new books, et cetera, and immersing yourself in the culture, you're listening to OCD based podcasts. That is such a huge part. So I know for me, when I finished my treatment, it felt like a whole part of my life was shaken up. And I found such warmth in this community. And that's why I'm always such a big proponent of it. And I've loved, people like Liz and people like Ethan and all the people I've gotten to meet in this community. But I also think besides giving me a sense of community and belonging and acceptance, it's helped keep me honest. It's helped me prevent from like deep relapses because I'm doing ERP with clients all day. I'm talking about OCD based themes all day. Certain words that people posted would have triggered the heck out of me 10 years ago. Some of these questions would have triggered me. The question about like smelling, that would have suddenly made me have to start doubt. Do I smell? Should I smell more? So my point is like being a part of the community after and coming to conferences and just sticking with it has been healing for myself, healing for my past self. But there's something about supporting others that I think is such a kind of like master level recovery. Is like when you start supporting others, whether it can be like talking to others about OCD or posting on a Facebook page or something, there's something healing about that. And I think it really like weakens the OCD. What about you? Because you're a great example of that as well. Like why do you think you stick with a community, and what has it given it to you? And like, what has it done for other people that you feel is keeps you, just going? It's a big part of your life.
Yeah, so like this, I owe a lot of this to a lot of the work that Michael Janicki did in our field. And, Mike talked so much, and we did conference talks on this early on with him and me and Ethan and others on how the final leg of treatment is community involvement and our belief that treatment, yes, can get you to a certain degree, but once you start doing for others and you start making that recovery piece a part of what you do, in the sense that like part of my recovery is being able to share information, share knowledge, share feedback with other individuals. It's almost like that final seal that you need that allows your treatment to continue to work, but more importantly, like allows your OCD to stay contained, right? Because you've turned to the point of giving back. If we think about like a traditional 12-step model for addiction, right? What is the final step, right? The final step is becoming a sponsor and then helping someone else, right? It's about using the tools and the learning that happened for you for someone else, and that helps maintain your recovery, but also gives purpose to your pain. Y'all hear me talk a lot about that I think that is so important, that if it's just, oh, I have this horrible battle with OCD and it stays that, or it stays that it was that, versus here's good that came out of it, right? Here's something meaningful or purposeful that I was able to do despite my suffering. Again, that doesn't mean you wanted your suffering or you want your OCD. Like, I want to be clear, like it's not one or the other. But I really do I think recovery is all about effective treatment, right? So understanding your disorder or disorders, first of all, getting the appropriate treatment for them, and then giving back, helping others, using your disorder to influence and help others turn that corner. And I know for me and you, Chris, like we're both clinicians, we help people clinically every day, but you also do so much still from like an advocacy perspective, not just this, but your support groups and these pieces where yes, you have a clinical lens, but it's also like an advocacy and support leg that's happening, right? Like that isn't just treatment all the time. Like I get this, I think I get so much from individuals that are like, hey, can I pick your brain about my treatment? Or can I hear from you because you have a lived experience? And I'm not their provider, but I'm able to just provide some insights and some perspective, that can be really useful.
I think, I was looking at one of the reviews from the July conference that we spoke together. And I think one of the things that somebody said is like they really appreciate that although you and I are clinicians, that we also share some of our lived experience. I think the other thing is like when I hear your story, my story, when I hear Ethan's story, I just think like people need to know that people with severe OCD, suicide attempts, isolation, housebound, multiple treatment centers, that you get better. I think people need to hear those stories that you can get better. And I know that we always are so defensive of ERP and the treatment because it was like life changing for us and it saved our lives. And I would argue that it gave me skills. Going back to one of your original questions today, it's like it gave me skills that I don't know if I would have ever received if I didn't go through treatment. And a lot of times, like when I hear my friends at my age talk about being lost and stuff, I don't feel lost. Like, my
Yeah.
dating life sucks, but outside of that, it's like I don't feel lost in like what I want to do. Like when I die, like I look at someone. Speaking of Michael Janicki, my mom always tells me, she's like, be like Michael Janicki in this field. You answer five more freaking emails. I don't care if you're tired, Chris. Like his spirit was such a good light. And I think that he kind of, this is going to sound cheesy as heck, but it's how I feel. I feel like he lives in all of us. And I'm getting emotional right now because like, the idea of like giving back to this community, to be a community, to keep speaking, to keep sharing hope. I think that's so important. There are people out there really, really suffering. And I want people to know that you don't have to suffer. I love your messaging, Liz. And I feel like you've led it about you shouldn't be suffering. Treatment isn't just learning how to suffer until you die. It's like, so anyways, you brought up Michael Janicki. It's getting me emotional.
It really is, and I will tell y'all, like, I struggle with this sometimes too, is like, oh, I'm tired, I don't have time, but there has never been an advocacy, mentorship, support conversation that I've regretted after, right? Like every time I do it, I feel so good about it. And I feel so happy that I gave that time. And sometimes it's like, I don't feel like I have the time and it feels exhausting to do it, but it is always so meaningful for me and for them. Right. And like the best way to serve yourself is to serve someone else. And, Mike had so many, just for those who don't know, Michael Janicki was one of the founders of this foundation, the founder of OCDI, and undoubtedly one of the biggest leaders in our field. And he passed away recently. And so it's been really tough for a lot of us and a very emotional journey because he was a mentor and a guider and our leader and for so many of us in this field. And the thing I loved that Mike always said that I try to remember is like patience first and everything else second. And he lived that, you guys. He gave everyone his personal email. He always made time for anyone. And his life mission was about, can we help make a difference? Like, don't worry about anything else. Worry about that first and everything else falls into place. And if you have that motto, I think that I know that that's the truth. And I just think that, I was taught this from a young age. My parents are really big believers of serving others. And we've always done that, whether it was serving the homeless on holidays or having foster kids in our home or adopted siblings. Like we were always about serving others. And I really do believe that you have to have purpose. You have to have meaning to be fulfilled in your life. And it doesn't come by serving yourself. Making ourselves feel good, right. Yes, that's important. Self-compassion and all these things are important. But really the way we get fulfilled as human beings is by serving others, is by knowing we've made a difference, right? That is such a good feeling. So think about that and don't ever think, oh, I'm not ready to serve people yet, or I'm not there yet, or I have to feel a certain way or be at a certain place to do that. Many of us started serving, and actually as we started serving, that allowed treatment to be more successful, right? Because we started getting involved in the foundation. Serving can be going to a support group, telling your story, right? That is serving. Like it's serving, you get help from it, but it's also serving other people. And then eventually you serve in different ways as your recovery continues and progresses.
One thought thought I had too is like love seeing all of the people coming out and advocating. I think of like on this stream, like Amy, who comes to our streams, I see the work she does on Facebook in different groups and like really sharing education. Matthew Bannister, who's somebody that comes to our lives as well, has really been helping. He spoke with John Grayson at the conference recently about visual Tourettic OCD, and he's really talking about that. We have people like Val, who's talking to people in the faith community, people of color, like, people of age. Like there's so many people advocating and sharing. And I'm not surprised that I I'm seeing more and more clients coming in that are younger and younger, getting treatment at 8, 9, 11, 12, versus the stories that most of us hear of like 25, 35, 55 for treatment. I wanted to throw this question to you because this is something that you've done a lot in the field too. It's more of a comment, but at 12:17, Nathan says, only one therapist in my town specializes OCD, but it's expensive. So I'm seeing a therapist that does CBT, which helps some. Because this is a common thing that comes up for people. So what would be your advice? Like, let's say because of finances, location, insurance, wait lists, like somebody can't maybe find like a really good OCD specialist. Is there value in seeing like a general CBT therapist, and how can they ensure that they're still getting good treatment? What are some options out there that can help them navigate that? Because I hear that a lot too.
Yeah, so I mean, the preference is that you could see a true OCD provider, which an OCD provider is going to do ERP and not CBT alone. And so it is going to be really important for you to try to find that. And so I always want to tell people to think about going to like academic institutions or any sort of larger centers or clinics, because they often will have sliding scale options and ways that you can get that treatment. But the other option is to also think about seeing that CBT provider, but using different resources. So books, self-help workbooks, whatever, to help guide both you and their work to be more ERP focused. Because what we know is that CBT alone is not going to treat OCD, but ERP will.
Good answer. I mean, that's what I say is like, it's not ideal, but there's some really, really good books out there. Obviously, John Grayson has a good book. I think it's Bruce Hyman has a really good, the OCD workbook. Like there's a lot of really, really good OCD books out there. So if you can go through it together, the good thing is a CBT therapist will have some foundations. I would suggest a CBT therapist versus somebody who treats like psychodynamic or couples, so you have that backbone. One of the questions we missed was, oh, go on. Sorry.
Sorry. So I just want to put in, I've seen a couple thoughts. And so just a reminder, if you're feeling unsafe or suicidal, we want you to please go to your local emergency room, call 911 or the suicide crisis at 988. It is critical that you stay safe. Unfortunately, IOCDF is not a crisis hotline, so we're not able to triage that, but here below are the resources for where you can.
Well said. This is a pre-submitted, but we also got it live today at 12:16. Can you talk about meditation and relaxation techniques in the context of OCD? When is it useful and when is it ritualistic? I know that Kim Quinlan just put out a podcast with Stuart Ralph about like OCD and meditation. And I saw some people confused because they're like, oh, I thought we weren't supposed to do it. So can you help answer that of like, when is it helpful and when is it ritualistic when it comes to like meditation and relaxation?
Yeah, so it is all about the function of the behavior, right? So ACT can actually be a huge ritual if you're using it incorrectly, right? So if you're thinking, okay, ACT is about me being able to notice this notebook and see the beautiful flowers that are on this notebook, like that can be a good ACT principle, to some degree. But if it's like, oh, I'm having this intrusive thought, so I'm going to hurry up and look at this notebook and notice the flowers to try to get rid of that thought, I'm actually using that technique to suppress or avoid OCD thoughts. And in that case, I'm actually using ACT really incorrectly in an ERP model. And so mindfulness is no different, right? Grounding, mindfulness, meditation can be really great, useful tools for yourself and your mental health, but it is not useful if you're using it to distract, if you're using it to avoid, if you're using it to suppress. So when we think about ERP, the model of ERP is about, can we allow intrusive thoughts and distress and do nothing about them, right? Allow them to be there and allow them to be unanswered. And so if you're using any technique, a DBT technique, a mindfulness technique, a ACT technique, to try to not have to think about that thought, to try to run from your OCD thought, you're going to stay more stuck. So you need to slow down first, allow space for that distress, allow the core fear work to happen, right? For you to lean into it. And then you can engage in mindfulness, different techniques, behavioral activation, you name it. So again, I want you to always think about, what is the function of this behavior?
I always say it can be beautiful general self-care. It shouldn't be a response to OCD.
So. Bingo. Yeah, love that. Well, great. Well, I love this talk. Today was so fun, you guys. I love being with you, and Chris, I love just getting to chat and share so much insight and all these different things. But happy Thanksgiving. Tomorrow's Thanksgiving, and I just want to give a quick message of gratitude, and I'll turn it over to Chris. But I am so grateful for you, for this community, for for all of you that are here, for your time and for your trust in both Chris and I to hopefully be able to provide some resources and support. I'm grateful for the foundation. I'm grateful for what IOCDF does. And I just truly, I'm grateful to have this community for me, because although, yes, we hope we're giving to you, you all give to us every day of our life. So thank you.
What I want to say to those that are struggling as the holiday seasons come, I've been there. Liz has been there. We know that it's very difficult. Use it as a goal, use it as motivation that one holiday you'll be sitting there and absolutely enjoying it and not allowing these disorders to take that from you. And we can be your community. Sometimes people will say holidays are hard because I don't have family. Hopefully you feel like this community's family, and we really appreciate you coming out and spending the day with us, or spending an hour with us, not the whole day. I do want to quickly shout out, we got a really nice message from Ole Petter, who just said that it's motivating and helpful, and greetings from Norway. And I have to say hi, because I always talk about my Greek half to the point that Liz makes fun of me, but I'm also half Norwegian. So hello, Ole. We might be related. So hi, Ole. But thank you so much, everyone.
Norway and the Northern Lights are on my bucket list, so maybe.
I have family that lives in Norway, so if I'm going to go. I was supposed
to go together.
I was supposed to go to Norway and Greece 2020, and I have to push it back. So when I go to Norway, you should meet me out there, and the Northern Lights look
there. We go.
I can't wait.
Yes. Okay, right, so good to see you guys. We love y'all. Happy Thanksgiving.
Don't forget to share this. It'll be up on the YouTube channel and Facebook for the IOCDF. Thank you for almost 3.5 million views on the IOCDF YouTube channel. We really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.